are dancing in heaven. You hear me?
Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up the people, Lord, wake up. Listen. Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up the people, Lord, wake up.
Listen. It's alright. It's okay. Remember, the sun will shine in the morning. God bless. Wake up.
This show is sponsored by Glass R Us, 730 Seven Sisters Road, London, N15 5NH. Call Glass R Us for all your glazing needs on 0208 800 6663. For your glass and double glazing repairs, shelving, tabletops, splashbacks, mirrors, shower cubicles, balustrades and balconies.
You can trust Glass R Us because they are completely transparent.
Aquaba family, Hotep, greetings. This is the Afrocentricity Bookman show. This is Brother Jegna. Don't forget, every Sunday, 4 to 6 p.m., we have been the Afrocentricity Bookman show. We are starting a new book today. And the book is called The History of the Black Dollar. I hope you guys had a great week. I hope you and your family are safe and everything is good. So, a new book today. Last week we finished reading the excellent book, The Black Matrix. I had a few comments from people who really enjoyed the show. And please make sure you go to the Facebook. Check up the Afrocentricity International UK group. It's a private group, so if you go into that group on Facebook and seek an invite, you'll be invited into the group, okay? But this is Brother Jegna. We are starting a new book today. So the book is by Angel Rich, and it's called The History of the Black Dollar. So I only just recently heard about this book, but the book was actually published in 2017. So it's got some history, US history, and it's got some economics in there as well. So we need history and we need economics, and we need it from our perspective. Remember, Afrocentricity is about us black people seeing the world through our own eyes, carrying out our own analysis, putting ourselves at the center of every phenomenon that we want to interrogate and look at. Okay, so let me continue. As we go through, we'll make some comments as we go through. This is Best Radio. Please tune into Best Radio. You can tune into the .com, or you can tune in by TuneIn app. Please tell your family and friends about this. Every Sunday, 4 to 6 p.m., the Afrocentricity Bookman show. So, the history of the black dollar. Let me read the forward to you. African Americans have always worked hard for their dollars, but their dollars have not always worked for them. From the earliest time on US soil, there are examples of blacks combining their ingenuity and labor to create innovative and lucrative businesses, managing to achieve financial success and social and political influence, even during the darkest chapters of our nation's history. Nevertheless, the story for the vast majority of African Americans has been one of economic marginalization and financial struggle. Released from enslavement with nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever skills they managed to accumulate on the plantations, African Americans made the remarkable transition from being human capital. Remember, there wasn't even human beings, yeah? There was actually property. From being human capital to learning how to generate capital to support their families in a racialized system where they were too often met with the maximum opposition to their success. Despite surviving the indignities and horrors of the Jim Crow era and finally achieving voter rights, equal access to public accommodations, and broader educational opportunities during the civil rights era, many of the same systematic barriers that have historically plagued African Americans continue to be a factor today. This circumstance is measured through what we refer to as the racial wealth gap, the economic divide that leaves blacks with a fraction of the wealth of whites. Contrary to assumptions about African American spending patterns, researchers have shown that most of this gap can be explained by discriminatory policies, different educational and home ownership experiences, and labor market practices that too often leave blacks with the short end of the economic stick. Depending on the data source, whites are estimated to have about 10 to 17 times the median wealth of blacks. Let me repeat that. Depending on the data source, whites are estimated to have about 10 to 17 times the median wealth of black people. When looked at on a dollar basis, the typical African American family only owns 6 cents for every dollar of wealth owned by the typical white family. So imagine that. For every dollar that a white European family have in the USA, Africans on average have 6 cents. So 94 cents less for every dollar. And obviously, as we go through the book, I'm sure we'll find out. This is the first time I read this book with you, so we could be learning together, yeah? The history of the black dollar. But as we go through, we'll see what the it's state practice to keep blacks impoverished. And as I'm sure you know, no matter where we were, whether it's the African continent, whether it's the Caribbean, so-called Caribbean, the idea is to keep blacks impoverished. France today takes out something like 400 billion euros out of their former enslaved and colonized African colonies. They're supposed to be independent, but they're not independent if France takes out 400 billion euros out of Africa. They say, oh, Africa's poor, Africa's poor. France takes out 400 billions of their wealth every year. Imagine taking out 400 billion for the past 50 or 60 years. What could Africa do with 400 billion every year for the past 56 years? So I continue. This means that income diverted into savings, investments and businesses and other appreciating assets should be the primary vehicle through which African Americans build wealth. Yet there is also a racial income gap, with blacks and Latinos earning only 67 cents for every dollar of earnings made by whites. Given these disparities, it is not a surprise that the racial wealth gap exists at every income quintile. However, many people do not know that the racial wealth gap is largest at the lowest income quintile. I think quintile, it must be the measurement, yes, a form of measurement. With low income African Americans possessing 0% of the wealth of low income whites. Indeed, one study found that the average black family would need 228 years to build the wealth of a white family in 2016. I definitely need to repeat that one. Indeed, one study found, and this was a 2016 study, found that the average black family would need 228 years to build the wealth of a white family. So where do we go from here? There is no doubt that the African American should, to the extent possible, Resist Americans' consumer culture that encourages constant spending on frivolous items of little or depreciating value. African Americans should also take pains to avoid businesses and banks, such as payday lendings and bank offering exploitative loans with bad terms that use wealth stripping business models to pad their bottom lines. The biggest task ahead is launching and achieving a wealth equity policy and political agenda that pushes for systematic investments in K-12 financial literacy and capability, K-12 exposure to the principles and practices of entrepreneurship, post-secondary business accelerators, targeting entrepreneurs of color and entrepreneurs from any race, from low-income households, guaranteed access to business capital and support, better opportunities for building matched savings over a lifetime, in brackets, baby bonds, child savings, accounts, portable retirement accounts, and social security, close brackets. Anti-wealth stripping laws that protect assets and other opportunities for economic inclusion. We also need to get our minds right, and that is number one in my book, because some could give you $1 billion tomorrow. What will you do with that $1 billion if your mind's not right? We keep on talking about reparations, and boy, reparations are due. Everybody gets reparations except for the African, except for the black person. But it's almost a cynical joke that if black people was given reparations tomorrow, by Friday we will be giving it back to the same people who gave it to us. Unless our mind is right, unless we know we've got African-centered thought. So we know what to do with the money, how we invest it, where we spend it, where is it most needed. So these are major parts of the reparation movement. If money was given to us, which my view is, boy, I don't know if we're going to get it, because you can see no matter who these people are, Europe, including this place here we live in, this cold place here called England, Britain, the USA, everybody gets reparations. Everybody. To Native Americans, to Jewish people, the Japanese, everybody gets reparations except for the African. And why? Who are we asking for reparations? I think is the key to it. So I'm a big believer in the Honourable Excellency Marcus Messiah Garvey. Marcus Garvey said, do not ask anybody for nothing. Which is probably bad vocabulary there. Do not ask anybody for anything. You can't ask somebody for nothing. Do not ask anybody for anything. Do for yourself. Come together and do for yourself. Certain communities, and we've been through quite a few economic books in this show over this past few months, and some people, they've got their internal economy, so they don't really care if it's blue or red gets into power. They don't care what the name of the party is, whether it's number 10, whether it's the White House, wherever it is, they don't care. Why? Because they've got their internal economic system. The internal economic system keeps them shrouded, you could say, in strength. So we need to understand economics, and this is what this book is here. I thought I'll read this book here. He was going to give us some good tips, some good ideas, give it the history of the USA. But unless we sort out our internal economy, we're going to struggle. We don't need to ask anybody for anything. Don't get me wrong, if we need some skills, some training, even mentorship, I've got no problem with going and ask for that. But for the most part, if we come together, we've got enough resources. The USA, if they add up the wealth what the African Americans of USA have, they're something like the 12th or the 16th strongest nation in the whole world. The Africans in the UK as well. We believe we don't have money. We've got plenty of money. but it doesn't stay in our community. We seem to want to give it away because of our financial literacy is not at the level it should be. That's why we read these books. We need to educate ourselves so we can see the world through our own eyes. So this is the Afrocentrist, the Bookman show. We just started reading the history of the black dollar. So we also need to get our minds right. If used properly, the black dollar cannot only provide our families with generational wealth, it can also accelerate the liberation of our communities. For this reason, I am proud of the knowledge and awareness that Angel Rich seeks to bring to the African Americans through her seminal history of the black dollar, by uplifting African Americans' stories as they relate to money and wealth. She enlightening and inspiring a new generation of economic social justice warriors to take the helm in the fight to build a truly inclusive economy. So that was the foreword. So, slaves had no control over their lives as laborers. So this is chapter 1, okay? So this is the Afrocentricity Bookman show. We are reading the history of the black dollar, a 2017 book by Angel Rich. The slave trade was an economic institution, exporting and exploiting free labor from Africa, directly contributed to the modern development of America, the Caribbean, Latin America, as well as the demise of Africa. We mentioned, so I'd like to say very quickly, I mentioned last week, imagine, for 4 centuries, the 15 to 25-year-olds were taken out of Africa. 400 years, the most creative minds were taken out, were stripped out of Africa. So not only was the labor of these people given to somebody else, the brains were taken away from Africa as well for 4 centuries. It was like a double barrel. I continue. Legally, slavery allowed people to maintain the right to purchase their own and own other human beings as property. These individuals were not simply an institution that benefited propertied individuals. It was an economic system that allowed the United States, particularly the southern states, to develop as it did. Slavery also hinged on the modern pseudo-scientific concept of race, which is based on skin color. By contrasting a belief of biological differences based on color, people who are called white justified the oppression of people who were called black. Started in 1619, slavery served as a nucleus for racial and economic injustice. This system prevented blacks from receiving wages while providing high amounts of wealth for whites. While all whites did not own slaves, the socio-economic gains were massive and received by all whites. This division created the hotbed for the economic divide that still exists today. Rich in agriculture, the South cultivated tobacco, rice, sugar, cotton, wheat, and hemp as the unimpedance of its economy, all grown by Africans. As the South became deeper, these industries became larger. Tobacco and hemp were staples in Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, while Maryland and Virginia focused on wheat. South Carolina and Georgia were prone to rice and reigned in Louisiana. But throughout all the states, cotton stretched from the Carolinas to Texas. From the onset of the country through 1850 was the most important crop in America. Slaves managed large plantations, doing everything from cooking, washing, sewing, blacksmithing, barrel making, selling, horse training, growing crops, and a myriad of other activities. Each enslaved African received 1 piece of clothing per year, usually some form of burlap. That's like the roughest material you could find. And they receive 1 to 2 meals per day, depending on the masters and it was usually grits, the cheapest possible nutritionless food they could find for us. Most enslaved Africans used food from the garden as a sea to supplement the meals that they were provided, creating southern classic meals such as shrimp and grits. Collard greens were discovered by slaves attempting to find food deep in the woods. Slaves also used the garden to make homemade remedies for illnesses, since doctors were only called for highly valued slaves. The power and circulation of the black dollar began in 1621. Shortly after slavery started, a group of black Virginians in 1621 earned enough money to purchase land, where they formed a store selling tobacco and rice. By 1700, blacks started learning Native American tongues, which created more opportunities for them as trappers, scouts, traders, and liaisons for whites. George Bonga from Dudo, Minnesota, was a trader, trapper, and interpreter. At the signing of the Chippewa Treaty in 1834, James Beckwourth, a freedman and entrepreneur, helped Native Americans discover a pass through the Sierra Nevada mountains, named in his honor. Okay, we need to look into that one. James Beckwourth, a freedman and entrepreneur, helped Native Americans discover a pass through the Sierra Nevada mountains, named in his honor. Another famous man named York, William Clark Slave, served as a guide for the Lewis and Clark expedition. His unique features and great strength were viewed with astonishment and awe by Native Americans encountered across the continent. His presence was considered a remarkable phenomenon that enhanced the prestige of the white strangers who never had seen previously by the isolated Indian plantations. Emmanuel Bernoulli and his wife Mary started another black business of grave importance, started in 1736. It is a little known fact that this black couple opened America's first oyster and ale house in Providence, Rhode Island. In 1778, Richard Allen and Alberson Jones saw a budding economy of the black community and formed the Free African Slave Society, the first organization to help educate newly freed people on the socio-economic issues. So let me just say very quickly that you see they were called the Free African Slave Society. They weren't Negroes, they weren't niggers, they knew they was Africans. Very simple, yeah? Okay. Always remember, we left Africa, and wherever we landed, we were still Africans. In 1800, blacks owned several businesses, but they were small in size and focused on the service industry. However, there was a few exceptions. Mr. James Forten created a niche market for himself by becoming a master sailmaker who invented and patented a method for handling sails for sailboats. In 1832, he managed a full staff that included blacks and whites in his Philadelphia plant, grossing £10,000 in 1846. So if you imagine, in 1846, $10,000, I should say, is an awful lot of money. In 1846, Aaron Washington became the largest cattle rancher in Jefferson County, Texas, owning 2,470 cattle and 4,578 acres of land. Blacks were also among the first to master financial product sales in America. Tommy Lafon, real estate broker and businessman, generated $500,000 during his life. In fact, he left the money to several New Orleans charities, including a black school. Shortly after he died, Louisiana's legislature recognized him for his charitable contributions to New Orleans. Despite these advancements, majority of blacks remained in the harsh chain of slavery. During idle times, slaves would be leased to industrial employees, and during even rougher times, or simply at will, will be sold from 1805 to 1860. There was a well-established market for slaves, which meant that the slave was a highly liquid asset that could be easily converted to cash if the owner wished to sell the slave for any reason. Females were particularly valued for childbearing to increase their stock. Considered under the law to be both a person and property, the slaves had no control over their lives as laborers. In 1860, approximately 400,000 whites owned 4 million slaves. Let me repeat that. Considered under the law to be both a person and property, the enslaved Africans had no control over their lives as laborers. In 1860, approximately 400,000 whites owned 4 million slaves, equated to 12% of the white population, controlling more than half of the slaves of the country, creating a power elite. With this esteemed help, it's fascinating to know that the South still lagged the North by 20% in manufacturing. Wages for whites were lower in the South, with per capita income of $103 compared to $141 in the North. The South was slow to develop due to a lack of reliable transportation, well-trained managers, and modern technology. Willie Lynch, 1712. Okay, he's got here the Willie Lynch letter. Let me say to you, Willie Lynch is not real. The author of Willie Lynch, who was a professor, has owned up to writing it. Willie Lynch letter is not real. The details of the Willie Lynch letter, we know it's true. To separate them, make them hate each other. The dark hate the light, and the light hate the dark. Women hate men. We know it's kind of the concepts behind it is true. However, Willie Lynch is not real. The Willie Lynch, there was nobody called Willie Lynch. But let me read it anyway. Willie Lynch, 1712. Gentlemen, I greet you here on the banks of the James River in the year of our Lord 1712. First, I shall thank you, the gentlemen of the colony of Virginia, for bringing me here. I am here to help you solve some of your problems with slaves. Your invitation reached me on my modest plantation in the West Indies, where I have experimented with some of the newest and still the oldest methods of control of slaves. Ancient Rome would envy us if my program is implemented. It is our boat sailed south on the James River, named for our illustrious king, whose version of the Bible we cherish. I saw enough to know that your problems is not unique. While Rome used cords of wood and as crosses for standing humans' bodies along the highways in great numbers, you are here using the tree and the rope on occasions. I caught a whiff of a dead slave hanging from a tree a couple of miles back. You are not only losing valuable stock by hangings, you are having uprisings, slaves running away. Your crops are somewhat left in the fields, too long for maximum profit. You suffer occasional fires. Your animals are killed. Gentlemen, you know what your problems are. I do not need to elaborate. I am here to enumerate your problems. I am not here to enumerate your problems. I am here to introduce you to the method of solving them. In my bag here, I have a foolproof method for controlling your black slaves. I guarantee every one of you that is installed. I guarantee every one of you that, if installed correctly, it will control the slaves for at least 300 years. My method is simple. Any member of your family or your overseer can use it. I have outlined a number of differences among the slaves, and I'll take these differences and make them bigger. I use fear, mistrust, and envy for control purposes. These methods have worked on my modest plantation in the West Indies, and it will work throughout the South. Take a simple list of all the differences and think about it. On top of my list is age, but that is only there because it starts with an A. The second is colour or shade. There is intelligence, size, sex, sons of plantation, status on plantation, attitude of owners, whether the slaves live in the valley or on the hill, east, west, north or south, have fine hair or coarse hair, is tall or short. Now that you have a list of differences, I shall give you the outline of action. But before that, I shall assure you that distrust is stronger than trust, and envy is stronger than adulation, respect or admiration. The black slaves, after receiving this indoctrination, will carry on, and it will become self-refueling and self-generating for hundreds of years, maybe thousands. Don't forget, you must pitch the old black male versus the young black male against the old black male. You must use the dark-skinned slaves versus the light-skinned slaves, and the light-skinned versus the dark-skinned. You must use the female versus the male, and the male versus the female. You must also have white servants and overseers who distrust all blacks. But it is necessary that your slave trust and depend on us. They must love, respect and trust us only. Gentlemen, these kits are your keys to control. Use them. Have your wives and children use them. Never miss an opportunity. If used intensely for 1 year, the slaves themselves will remain perpetually distrustful. Thank you, gentlemen. So that is the so-called Willie Lynch letter, but I've got a book here, and I could show you that it's actually Willie Lynch letter, not a real letter, written by an enslaver from Barbados, from the Caribbean, of the British Times, yeah, but the concept behind it we know are real. So I continue. This is the Afrocentricity Bookman show. We are reading the history of the black dollar. King Cotton, 1793. This is a quote here by Eric Williams. Eric Williams wrote the book Capitalism and Slavery, and he became the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago after, the colony got freedom from Britain, so-called freedom. Eric Williams said, the enslavement of millions of slaves helped Europe to acquire the capital needed to finance the Industrial Revolution. In 1754, the number of slaves peaked at 250,000. At that time, the number of slaves in America were beginning to dwindle, a result of the Revolutionary War, with many believing that slavery was coming to an end. Tobacco lands were beginning to deteriorate, and southern crop prices were declining. In 1789, the U.S. Congress was established, and in 1794, George Washington called southern slave a very troublesome species of property. However, technology intervened. Eli Whitney, I'm sure you've heard, Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin. In 1793, Eli's father had solved the critical problem of removing seeds from cotton by developing a kind of comb to do the job. Whitney's cotton gin simply mechanized this comb. Suddenly, with profits on the horizon, the slave population jumped from 250,000 to 4 million. So you hear that, the cotton gin, a mechanized way to pick the cotton and create cotton, slavery just had a boost again. It jumped from 250,000 to 4 million in the US. The demand for cotton from the North and Europe skyrocketed as the South had the best and cheapest cotton in the world. The slave economy then shifted from the upper South, Maryland and Virginia, to the lower South. While the slave trade had abolished in 1808, expansion of slavery continued into the lower South from the domestic slave trade of the upper South. The South experienced its first major nationally publicized uprising in 1822 in Charleston, South Carolina. After being suppressed by the city, Denmark Vesey, a free minister, planted planned an insurrection. However, the plan was exposed 2 months before the riot was to take place. Sadly, an African told the white man that Denver Vesey was going to start the uprising. Vesey was trialed and hung along with 36 co-planners. Charleston firmly displayed their punishment throughout the country to discourage any future for uprising. In 1830s, cotton was king, and more than half of the U.S. exports consisted of slave-grown cotton. Let me repeat that. In 1830s, cotton was king, and more than half of all U.S. exports consisted of enslaved-grown cotton. You can see how important Africans were to the USA. In fact, slaves grew 60% of the world's cotton, thus paying for a substantial amount of iron and manufactured goods that led to more American growth. The increase of labor needed to grow and manage the cotton exasperated. Let me repeat that. The increase of labor needed to grow and manage cotton exasperated the slave population and worsened their treatment. This tension led to the most famous slave rebellion in the history of America, led by Nat Turner, who was truly a great man. A black slave in Wolverhampton, Virginia, Nat received a vision from God to free the slaves. He started by uniting his friends, killing his masters, and then moving on to kill all the slave owners in the surrounding neighborhood. His movement quickly grew in numbers and violence. His soldiers, as he referred to them, killed more than 50 white men, women and children. The results of this rebellion are still felt throughout the veins of American society today. Whites were terrified, increasing the amount of random arrests and attacks on blacks out of fear. By 1850, 1.8 million of the 2.5 million slaves were on cotton plantations, primarily as field hands. Commercial crops produced, the slaves required a host of middlemen. The North focused on a myriad of businesses that supported cotton production in the South, such as textile factories, insurance companies, shippers, and cotton brokers. The irony is not missed that Eli Whitney was himself a black slave, known on paper as a white man named Sam. Plenty of slave created plant inventions and new technologies, but they were not allowed to paint at them. In 1858, the U.S. Attorney General ruled that since slaves were property, their ideas, including patents, were also the property of their masters. For this reason, many blacks, slaves or free, would file patents in their lawyers' names to improve their chances of acceptance. There were also another slave, Jefferson Davis, who created a new screw propeller for steam-driven ships. Naturally, it was not patented, but it did help the South progress in the war. Henry Blair became the first freedman to receive a patent in 1834 for a new seed planter. The cotton plantation economy was part of the much larger local, national, and international political economy. The financial, shipping, and manufacturing industries were all dependent on slave-produced cotton. Given that cotton ran the United States and the US was competing for leadership in the global political economy, it is inarguable that slaves were the foundation of the US cotton economy. Banks will provide seed investments to purchase land and slaves. Slaves were literally viewed as a form of property, a commodity that could easily be sold and converted into cash, individually and collectively, and were often traded as collateral for goods. services, and a multitude of businesses transactions. Slaveholders leverage their slaves as shares of investment, using them to secure loans and pay off debt. Sometimes entire families would get destroyed from the slaveholder, place bets that they couldn't cover, or would pay with their slave instead. When assessing estates' values, the value of the slaves would be included. Taxes were even paid on the slaves' transactions, provided tax revenue source for local and state government. Basically, United States turned slavery into a political capital, leveraging cotton. Taking it a step further, the U.S. Constitution incorporated the 3/5 Compromise that allowed the South to count their slaves as 3/5 of a person when calculating the state's representation in Congress. This shifted the balance of power from the North to the South. So let me interject there. We always hear that Africans were, and it's true, were classed as 3/5 of a human being. They wasn't even a human being. They were 3/5 of a human being. But part of this was that voting power, or the people in the North or the South, when they counted the slaves as 3/5 of human beings, they counted them as adding them up as people, and that empowered the South, because they say they had more voting power or more people in the South. So this is a strange thing of history, yeah? Africans are 3/5 of human beings, and as you know, people still treat that like us today, you know? Okay, but I continue. It is inconceivable that the European colonists could have settled and developed North and South America and the Caribbean without slave labor. Moreover, slave labor did produce the major consumer goods that were the basis of world trade during the 18th and early 19th centuries: coffee, cotton, rum, sugar, and tobacco. We've said before on this show that there will be no Europe without Africans. There will be no USA without Africans. These places were a wasteland until they got the Africans. In 1944, Eric Williams, we spoke about before, first Prime Minister after Trinidad and Tobago got independence, Eric Williams was a Prime Minister. He published a book called Capitalism and Slavery, which everybody should get, Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams, where he depicted slavery as the growth engine for Europe's global economy. In it, he stated that the enslavement of millions of slaves helped Europe to acquire the capital needed to finance the Industrial Revolution. Thus, Europe and America's progress was paid for at the expense of black slaves who built the foundation for modern capitalism. Interestingly, it will be the same need for economic self-interest and preservation, not ethical obligation, that will cause the North to fight to end slavery nearly 300 years after its start. So, do Africans deserve reparations? I think we all know the answer. There will be no USA. 60%, 1830s, 60% of cotton in the world was grown, cultivated, and reaped by Africans. 60% of all the cotton in the world. How much did the Africans get paid for that? But how much millions did it create for the people in slaveholders? The people brutalizing and raping and murdering Africans and burning them, raping their children. Millionaires. Interestingly, it will be the same need for economic self-interest and preservation, not ethical obligation, that will cause the North to fight for the end of slavery nearly 300 years after its start. It's amazing, because we went to school, but you don't learn this at school. They speak about all the Industrial Revolution. I learned about the Industrial Revolution at school, but I wasn't taught that it was Africans. African created the money, created the capital, so the Industrial Revolution could start. In Captain of Slavery, they bought that steam engine called the Rocket. Slave money created by the enslavement money that came from the enslavement African people. Paul Coffey, 1759-1830. Paul Coffey, an African activist, explorer and pioneer. Paul Coffey spelled Cuffee. This is 1759 to 1817. Born in Cuttyhunk Island in Massachusetts in January 17th, 1759, Paul Coffey, because I think they got coffee from, obviously, Ghana. The Akan people got coffee. Kofi is a name. So a lot of times his name came from Africa. But Paul Coffey was one of 10 children of a freed slave and a farmer. In 1766, his father purchased a 116 acres farm in Dartmouth, Massachusetts, on Buzzard Bay. Upon his death, he left the farm to Paul and his brother John. Leveraging his inheritance, Paul bought and built ships, developing his own maritime enterprise that involved trading the length of the US Atlantic coast, with trips to the Caribbean and Europe. Did we hear that? His father died and he left many of his acres and obviously wealth contained in it to Paul and his brother John. Leveraging his inheritance, Paul bought and built ships, developing his own maritime enterprise that involved trading the length of the US Atlantic coast, with trips to the Caribbean and Europe. By 1870, he had become highly active in political affairs. Along with his brother and 5 other black men, he filed a petition to protest free blacks not having a right to vote in the election. Interestingly, he was arrested, but his taxes got reduced. Paul felt that free blacks could establish a prosperous colony in Africa. He dreamed of sending at least one ship full of blacks to Sierra Leone every year, with the ship returning with African goods to be sold. Great Britain erected a settlement in Sierra Leone for London's Committee of the Black Poor. In 1787, it was named the Province of Freedom. Many of the blacks that heavily populated Sierra Leone had found escape from the Revolutionary War via the British black loyalists. So I'm interjecting here, when the War for Liberation, the Revolutionary War, fighting to get rid of Britain off their back, the Britain got the enslaved Africans to fight for the British, and they said, you fight for us and we'll take care of you, we'll give you land afterwards. So the Africans fought for the British, and amazingly the British actually kept their word, which is a very rare thing, kept the word to these Africans and actually sent many of them to different colonies like Sierra Leone really, and settled many of them there. No doubt it was some sort of benefit to them, but they kept their word and took many of them there. The following year, he visited Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York to establish an American version of the British Committee of the Black Poor. Paul named his organization the African Institution. It had a self-contained branches in every city, and was charged with mounting a coordinated, black-directed immigration movement. James Fulton, the wealthy sailmaker and inventor, was Paul's close friend. He was the secretary of the Philadelphia African Institution. And Prince Saunders, a teacher and secretary of the African Masonic Lodge, was the secretary of the Boston African Institution. It quickly picked up momentum amongst the northern black thought leaders. In 1807, America established an embargo on British goods, and was weakening relations with Great Britain. On April the 19th, 1812, at Westport, Massachusetts, Paul's ship was seized by the US Customs upon his return from Sierra Leone and Great Britain. He was charged with violating the embargo, and the US denied the release of his cargo. At that point, Paul appealed directly to the President James Madison. On May the 2nd, 1812, Paul Coffey became the first black man to sit down in the White House with the President himself and Albert Gallatin, Secretary of the Treasury. After pleasant exchanges and a great conversation about building a black colony in Africa, the President ordered the release of Paul's property. In a historic exertion, Paul Coffey sent 28 blacks, including 20 children, to Sierra Leone on December the 10th, 1815, spending $5,000. Upon their arrival in February the 3rd, 1816, the explorers became the first blacks to voluntarily return to Africa through a black initiative. Sadly, Paul's dream of building a great nation in Africa began to dissipate. In a letter to Paul Coffey dating January 25th, 1817, James Fulton depicts a large meeting of blacks at Richard Allen's Bethel AME, African Methodist Episcopal, I can't even think of the term now, AME Church. I'll continue. He said 3,000 at least attended, and there was not one soul that was in favor of going to Africa. They think that the slaveholders want to get rid of them so as to make their property more secure. And doubling down on his perspective, Fulton co-authored a statement, and later that year in August, saying the plan of colonizing is not asked for by us. We renounce and disclaim any connection with it. Possibly from heartache, Paul Coffey died 1 month later, in September 7th, 1817, killing the dream of black-led emigration movement. The movement would later be picked up again by the likes of Marcus Garvey, Henry Garnett, as Henry Highland Garnett, and others. So a little bit of history there earlier there. What we're going to do, people, we're going to take a short break here. Hope you enjoy the book there. So you just see that what we just read there. He just shows you that Africans didn't have agent. They like to project the image of Africans not having agency. We sat down and we didn't do anything, and white people told us to do this, and we did that. You can see it's all rubbish. As you can see, Africans were great manufacturers, great workers in their own right. They was inventors. They invented hundreds of things after slavery. Just after slavery, within the first year, they did something over 100 patents of inventions from Africans. But we saw during enslavement, many of the patents what people had, because they were property, the slave master took it for them. But the genius of African is not known, it's not really told. But we can see how amazing they shipbuilding. He created a shipbuilding navigation firm. So there's nothing that we can't do, because it's nothing we haven't done before. So anyway, what we're going to do, we're going to take a short break here, and we'll be back on the other side.
This show is sponsored by Glass R Us, 730 Seven Sisters Road, London, N15 5NH. Call Glass R Us for all your glazing needs on 0208 800 6663. For your glass and double glazing repairs, shelving, tabletops, splashbacks, mirrors, shower cubicles, balustrades and balconies.
You can trust Glass R Us because they are completely transparent.
It's for our people, yeah. Gonna shout it out loud, shout it out loud, yeah. Where is the black man's paradise that Marcus Garvey fought for yesterday? And we're still fighting for today, yeah. Where is the black man's paradise that Bob Marley fought for yesterday? And we're still fighting for today, yeah. Where is the black and we're still fighting for today. This may be harsh to say, but we're living in a white world. It's a statement that many fear to say, but Jah is our protector and we fear not to say. It's a prejudice world, yeah, it's a prejudice world. Where is the black man's paradise? Malcolm X fought for yesterday, and we're still fighting for today. Yeah. Where is the black man's paradise? Nyabingi elders fought for yesterday, and we're still fighting for today. It's their unity and their philosophy that gives them superiority, calling us minority, and in their heart they know we're the majority. It's a prejudice world, yeah, in a prejudice world. Where is the black man's paradise? Harriet Tubman fought for yesterday, and we're still fighting for today. Yeah. Where is the black man's paradise? Sister Nanny fought for yesterday, and we're still fighting for today. Take a moment to sit down and meditate. History will recall everything we convey. I hope the message in this song will provide the strength you need to shout it out aloud. It's a prejudice world, yeah, prejudice world, yeah. Where is the black man's paradise? Nelson Mandela fights for today. Louis Farrakhan fights for today. Yes, yeah. Where is the black man's paradise? That the Rastaman fights for today. That the ghetto youth cry for today. Yes, yeah. Where is the black man's paradise? That the singers sing about today, that the musicians play for today. Yes, yeah. Where is the black man's paradise? What will we tell the youth? Yeah. What will we tell the children? Yes. Oh, we cry, yeah, we cry, yeah. Oh.
Them can't take my soul, you know.
So you beat them, so you mistreat them, so you lock them down, and you think that you've won, but them a whole a meditation out in a iration. Them a follow Rastafari and I live upright. So tell me where you are gonna do now. Tell me what you gonna do now. Tell me what you gonna do now that the youth are positive spirits, but the youth them not feel it. Come around with your white lies, trying to blind everyone's eyes, but them a whole a meditation. Oh, in the iration. Them a follow Rastafari, and I live upright. So tell me where you are gonna do now. Tell me what you gonna do now. Tell me what you gonna do now. That the youth are all them roots. You can't water down and dilute. You can't hide the truth from the youth. You can't steal the fruit, not the root. 'Cause the youth are all them roots. You can't water down and dilute. You can't hide the truth from the youth. You can't steal the fruit, not the root. Hey, 'cause the youth are all them roots. Live up now, youth. Live up now. Live up now. Hey, yeah. Live up now, youth. Live up now. Youth, all your roots. Hey, them can't water down and dilute. Them can't hide the truth from the youth. You can't steal the fruit, not the roots. 'Cause the youth are all them roots. Cause the youth are all them roots. Hold on to your roots. Youth, hold your youth, them are all them roots.
Lord boy, na 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 na. Rastafari. Lord boy, na 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 na. Rastafari. Na 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 na. Holy Mount Zion, I'm coming home to you. Holy Mount Zion, I'm coming home to you. I face a lot of trials and tribulation, but through all of that I man still stand strong. Giving thanks and praise to the Almighty One, and looking forward to reach Mount Zion. And I man say, Zion, I'm coming home to you. Holy Mount Zion, I'm coming home to you. They said I don't have no rights in a Babylon, because I don't know how the West was won. Neither I can't change their plan. The West is controlled by the Ku Klux Klan. That's why I say, Zion, I'm coming home to you. Teach the youths them right, but not teach them wrong. Jackal up on the youths, cause the youths are strong. Look to Africa, that I feel your mama land. And down to Africa, where you find Mount Zion. And I man say, Zion, I'm coming home to you. Say, Holy Mount Zion, I'm coming home to you. I care not what the people of this world want to say, neither what the people of this world want to do. Many are called, but the chosen are few. What you gonna do when Jaja call on you? I man say, Zion, I'm coming home to you. Oh, Holy Mount Zion, I'm coming home to you. I've faced a lot of trials and tribulation, but through all of that I must still stand strong. Still giving praise to the Almighty One, and looking forward to reach Mount Zion. And I man say, Zion, I'm coming home to you. the bingy man him says Zion, I'm coming home to you. They said I don't have no rights in a Babylon because I don't know how the West was won. Neither I can't change their plan. The West is controlled by the Ku Klux Klan. Rastaman Zion, I'm coming home to you. Oh, Rasta says Zion, I'm coming home to you. One more time, Holy Mount Zion, I'm coming home to you. I cannot what the people of this world want to say, neither what the people of this world want to do. Many are called, the chosen of you. What you gonna do when Jaja call on you? Rastaman says Zion, I'm coming home to you. Holy Mount Zion, I'm coming home to you.
This show is sponsored by Glass R Us, 730 Seven Sisters Road, London, N15 5NH. Call Glass R Us for all your glazing needs on 0208 800 6663. For your glass and double glazing repairs, shelving, tabletops, splashbacks, mirrors, shower cubicles, balustrades and balconies.
You can trust Glass or Us because they are completely transparent.
Yes, family, this is Brother Jegna back on the other side. This is the Afrocentricity Bookman show. Don't forget, every Sunday between 4 and 6 p.m. GMT. We are reading a new book today. We are reading The History of the Black Dollar by a budding author, but a very, very strong on economics, Angel Rich. So we're reading the early part of the book now, and it just shows you after enslavement, even during enslavement in the USA, but after enslavement, Africans were amazing. Despite the fact what they've been through, inventions, industries. I knew about Eli Whitney created cotton gin, which speeded up, mechanized the creation of cotton. I didn't know he was an African. So it was patented by a European, Sam. But this is how you find things out. The only thing what tells us about today, the only criteria is history. History is so powerful. That's why we need to know our history, particularly our history. We need to know all history, but we must understand our history first. Because when our little youngsters go to schools, whether it's here in the US, UK, or in the USA, are they taught that we created shipbuilding industries straight after enslavement? Are we taught that we created the mechanization of cotton? We're not told these things because we're supposed to look up to other people more than ourselves, and that has a way of crushing down our self-esteem. So that's why it's important that we must read these things so we understand who we are. And all you parents listening, you must teach your children this stuff. You must fill your bookshelves up with books about us so our children can know about themselves, because remember, we are our ancestors. The same genes, the same DNA, the same melanin, the same as our ancestors. So we've got the same genius as well. So we need to understand who we are so we can move forward. Remember, our people was always top shelf, but our recent history we've been pummeled down to the bottom. The only good thing about being at the bottom is that there's only one way to rise, so we need to move up again. Anyway, the Black Dollar, I'm going to continue. This title here is called Gil Sage Salvo Perkins, founder of Words Live. Sage Salvo, born Gilbert Newman Perkins, is an artist, entrepreneur, Halcyon Incubator Fellow, and Economics PhD candidate. Sage had presented at the SXS Wedge Conference, South by Southwest, in Austin, Texas, the TEDx Mid-Atlantic Conference in Washington, D.C., the DC Educational Festival, and was a keynote speaker at the IB International Baccalaureate Americas Conference this past July. Sage, who is the founder and president of Words Live, LLC, and father of GGI, Contemporary Grammar Integration, Words Live is an educational program based on an original grammar transformation algorithm that Sage developed and obtained an international provisional patent on. The literary algorithm is a language evaluation and teaching process called CGI, Contemporary Grammar Integration. The Words Live program features algorithms and games that increase students' reading and writing proficiency over classroom texts, including novels, poems, plays, short stories, and other literary texts, all via the medium of popular urban music, social media text, and computer gramming language. Sage has developed partnership with Teach for America, City Year College Success Foundation, Guerrilla Arts, a COSBOC, and he is a 2011 MBA graduate from the University of Toronto and has also received 2 distinct bachelor degrees in accounting and finance from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. In 2003 and 2004 respectively, the Washington DC native is a registered member of the American Society of Composers, Authors and Publishers, and actively serves on several panels, radio show features and programs connected with education, technology, music and culture. Black Codes, 1821. And a quote here by William Costin: Constitution knows no distinction of colour, that all who are not slaves are equally free, equally citizens of the United States. Becoming the nation's capital in 1791, DC was formed from land the federal government provided Maryland and Virginia, 2 slave states of the Chesapeake. In 1800, blacks comprised 25% of DC's population at 14,093 majority slaves. Excuse me. As the demand in the nation's capital grew, blacks were forced to construct the US Capitol, the White House, and other historic buildings. That's one thing that never amazed me. Slave Africans built the White House. Keep that in mind. Major DC ports, Georgetown and Alexandria until 1846 became major hubs for the slave trade. Today, DC has one of the largest black populations in the country, and Alexandria is the owner of America's largest housing authority. Some DC slaves earned small wages and would save their money to buy their freedom. Others would gain freedom through the death of their masters. Reproducing for decades, the free black population started to expand. Pro-slavery whites, including the mayor, Robert Brent, began to grow concerned. So they introduced black codes. This was an effort to solidify slavery as an institution and to strengthen the concept of racial segregation in the city. They also restricted the meaning and practice of legal freedoms for free blacks. In 1808, the mayor and aldermen set forth the first set of black codes. With these laws in place, it became illegal for Negroes or loose, idle, disorderly persons to be outside after 10 p.m. If caught, blacks would be imposed a fine of $5, which is the equivalent of like $75 a day. And if you just came out of slavery, it's not quite, I don't know how you can have $75. Those that did not pay the fines would be whipped. These rules were light compared with the stricter set of codes introduced in 1812. Fines increased to $20 for curfew. So if it was $5 for $75, they took about over $200. For curfew, $200 a day that would be. Curfew violations and free blacks did not pay will be jailed for 6 months. Entering the conflict leasing programs. Slaves will be jailed and whipped with 40 lashes for non-payment. Furthermore, freemen were required to carry their freedom papers always. So think about that. They changed the rules. They created these laws called the Black Codes. And what do they mean? If you were found outside after 10 p.m., you get a fine, which would be equivalent of like $75 a day, and you'd be whipped. Later on, they changed it. You had to pay $20, which is like maybe $200 today. And if you did not pay, you'd be locked up for 6 months. Once you was in the system, they'll lease you out to companies called the convict leasing programs. And you'll be jailed and be whipped with 40 lashes for non-payment. And once you've been in this convict leasing program, chances are you could never get out of again. Because effectively they enslaved you again, saying that you was either loitering or idle or you was out after 10 p.m. at night. So you can see laws, they say laws like a good thing, but if their laws are written by a racist, then the laws are racist laws. Not to be outdone, Mayor Smallwood kicked it up a notch in 1821 with a new set of black codes. It required blacks to appear before the mayor with documents signed by 3 white people vouching for their good character, proving their free status. They also had to pay a peace bond of $20 to a respected white man as a commitment to good behavior. This code illustrates the precarious nature of freedom for non-enslaved African Americans by attempting to control the movement of people of color. Famous freemen such as William Costin refused to pay the peace bond. He argued that the Constitution knows no distinction of color, that all we are not slaves are equally free, equally citizens of the United States. Interestingly, the judge that presided over his case ruled that while the black codes were legal, they could not be enforced on freed men who were residents before the codes existed. While small in nature, it was a huge achievement for black America. Taking his victory further, Constant then contended that the concept of race was an ill-formed, as his ancestors were respectively Cherokee, European and African. Who was to define him as an African American? Starting in the late 1820s, groups began to organize and petition Congress for the abolition of slavery in D.C. There were more free blacks than slaves by 1830 in Washington. Thousands of petitions from slaves, churches, schools, societies, and businesses would make it through the House of Representatives' doors through the decade, leading Southern congressmen to establish the gag rule in 1836. This rule banned the introduction of any bills or petitions about slavery. This rule was also the result of the Snow Riot in 1835, with newspapers reporting that D.C. had its own Nat Turner. The paper stated that the 18-year-old slave Arthur Bowen attempted to kill Anna Marie Thornton, the wealthy widow of William Thornton, architect of the U.S. Capitol. Miss Thornton owned Arthur and his mother at her home in F Street Northwest. An angry mob of Irish mechanics gathered at Judiciary Square to demand the hanging of Arthur Bowen. The Irish mob. They were so upset with local abolitionists who were fighting to end slavery in D.C., pointing their attention to the Reuben Crandall of Georgetown. The mob had the police search his residence for anti-slavery material. Upon discovering various publications, Upon discovering various publications, he was charged with incitement to rebellion. The mob then demanded the hanging of Bowen and Crandall together. Being prevented by the police to reach either individual, the mob then set alight Mrs. Beverly Snow's eating house on 6th Street in Pennsylvania Avenue. Destroying the restaurant's furniture and inventory, Snow was forced to leave DC. The mob looked everything, and some apologies, the mob looted everything from Mrs. Snow's restaurant and then continued to destroy other black-owned businesses. Among them were some of the first Negro churches and schools from DC, owned by Reverend J. F. Cook. On the 14th Street Northwest, Reverend Cook too fled DC, landing in Pennsylvania. This riot was one of the most symbolic display of anti-slavery in DC at the time. So let me interject here. They said that, let me read it here, 80-year-old slave Arthur Boyne attempted to kill Anna Maria Thornton. And what happened after that? Places were burnt down, people were killed, people had to run away. And I was reading earlier, and I put on the Facebook group, Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells, she was a journalist. She wrote on newspapers, editorials. And in the city she was living in, 3 black men opened up a store, grocery store. And because it was taking money or custom from another white-owned store, they arrested and lynched the 3 black men, just murdered them in the street because they did not want competition. And she wrote in her editorial, this is Ida B. Wells, please look it up, people, that they always say that the black man's tempted to, rape a white woman, hurt a white woman, look at a black woman, white woman, anything so rubbish like that. And she said that's a big lie. It's nothing to do with that. She said it's economics. They scared, basically, put simply, they are scared of an even race of economics. If they're superior, they'll win out. But they always have to murder us and kill us and brutalize us. Why are they scared of competition? So she says that much of the lynching of black men was nothing to do with protecting the whiteness of the white women. It was about economics. Most of the people, so many of the people they lynched was to do with money. And as you just saw there, just like what they did in Black Wall Street, we're going to speak about later in this book, but when they burnt down these places, they loot all the houses. These law-abiding white people. And if you notice, you see how they started to lock up black people. If you're on the street after 10 o'clock, you'll be arrested. If you're idle, if you didn't have a job, we'll lock you up. If you didn't get 3 letters from white people to show you you're a good character, you'd probably be locked up again. This is how the concept got into the USA that black people are criminal. Because they created all these laws to lock up black people so they can re-enslave them. Slavery has ended, so they created laws to re-enslave them. And then, even today, what they say? Oh, black people are criminal. But this is how it started. The people who were subject to the worst criminal acts in history, enslavement of people for 300-400 years, are now called the criminals. So the people who are subject to the worst criminal behavior in human history then became the criminals. And what did your criminality entail? Not having a job, not having to pay bond. What they had to do, for example, if I say I was a white man, I could go up to a police officer and say, that guy over there, I lent him money and he didn't give it back to me. A black person. And a black person said, he didn't lend me the money, but because it's his word against yours, you'd be locked up. Which white man's going to lend a black man money? Let's be honest. And this is how they created these laws to enslave black people. The 13th Amendment, it says that, yes, black people are free and cannot be re-enslaved or are not a slave unless you commit a crime. Then you could be re-enslaved. And that was put in there into the 13th Amendment because they knew what they was going to do. They were going to re-enslave Africans, but said, oh, he's cropped up in prison because he committed a crime, and they re-enslave you. And that's why there's like 4 million black people in prisons now. There's more people in prison now than there was Africans enslaved in the USA. But the whole concept of them saying, oh, black people are criminal because they created laws and say, look, we fill up the prison with black people because they're criminals. But they hadn't done anything. Their crime was breathing while being black. I continue. This is the Afrocentricity Bookman show. This is Brother Jegna. We are reading The History of the Black Dollar by Angel Rich. The most famous and interesting slave revolt in DC was the Pearl Incident of 1848. 77 of the prettiest slaves, mostly women and children from Georgetown and Alexandria, attempting to escape on a 64-foot cargo. Chartered by two white men, Daniel Drayton and Captain Edward Sayers, the ship was growing a reputation for bringing slaves to freedom for a fee. The captain withstood the heavy risk because he needed the money. Daniel Bell, a free blacksmith working in a navy yard, was told he needed just $100 to help his family escape from DC. While they were legally free, lawyers had tied them up in court. Paying the fee would be a much cheaper option, an easier route to freedom. Bell joined together with other blacks, including the President, Madison slave Paul Jennings, and Samuel Edmondson, who wanted to help free his enslaved sisters, Emily and Mary. They were notoriously known throughout the DC for their beauty and were prized slaves. Excuse me. During the celebration of the new French Republic, while DC was filled with activity, the ship waited for the slaves at the wharf and on the Potomac River in southwest DC. They planned to reach the Chesapeake Bay and then sail to Pennsylvania. Since the ship could hold more than Bell and Edmondson families, others asked to join the excited crusade, reaching 77 passengers. The ship allowed anyone to board that could get on by midnight. Gathering in small groups on a dark Saturday night, the Pearl set sail down the Potomac River, heading to Alexandria, Virginia, I imagine. The next day, 43 white families woke up to find their slaves are gone and quickly formed a group to find them. Sponsored by the Justice of the Peace and others, 35 armed white men went frantically searching DC, MD and VA for the slaves by land. After searching all over for them by land, the slave owners received a tip of their whereabouts from a slave. This particular slave had a crush on one of the Edmondson sisters and did not wish for them to leave. So naive. In a very cryptic phrase, he hinted to the slave owners that the group had escaped by water, not horses, as they had previously assumed. With this news, the slave owners boarded the steamboat, Salem, and travelled 100 miles to overtake the Pearl at North Point Lookout, where weather had forced the Freedom ship to dock. The escape provided pro-slavery supporters with ammunition to attack abolitionists. For 3 days, both captains were arrested and the group of slave owners demanded they be hung. Most of the captured slaves were sold to the deep south of New Orleans and Georgia. It is rumored in DC some of the prettiest slaves were not sold or whipped due to their beauty, but rather forced to walk along a long distance as part of their punishment. A small select few gained their freedom through this initiative. While unsuccessful, the Pearl Incident was America's largest escape attempt and raised national attention for the abolition of slavery and the slave trade. Shortly after this incident, Congress voted to return the portion of DC that had been provided by Virginia in 1846. This forced all the blacks living in that portion to immediately lose any protection they had from DC, especially for education. All black schools closed immediately in that part of town and remained closed for 15 years until the Union Army entered Alexandria during the Civil War. The following year, an established white abolitionist, Gamaliel Bailey, became editor of the anti-slavery newspaper, the National Era. This newspaper was founded by the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society and focused on ending the slave trade in D.C. It was noted as being the original publisher of the Harriet Beecher Stowe's famous novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. With tension boiling over, the Compromise of 1850 was introduced to appease both sides by ending or preventing the introduction of slavery and the slave trade in new states, while allowing slavery and the slave trade to continue in the states already legal. This resulted in the introduction of a Slave Trade Act that prevented the importation of enslaved people into the new districts for resale or transportation elsewhere, but continued to be allowed the sale of enslaved district residents to slaveholders. The images of slaves walking through the DC handcuffed after being sold or being sent off for convict leasing did not leave the city. It was a precarious time for DC, as the free slaves outnumbered slaves by 2 to 1. To be exact, there were 8,461 freedmen and 4,694 slaves, according to the U.S. Census of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 and the repeat of the gag rule in 1844 drew national attention as momentum for abolitionists, sparking the demand for Congress to exercise its constitutional power to end slavery. Serving as the headquarters for the numerous Union officers or Union forces, black refugees, soldiers and sailors began flocking to DC. Refugee camps were created to accommodate the new residents, often near the sites of forts that are preserved throughout the district. There were camps in Duff Green Row on the 1st Street between East Capitol and A Street Southeast, and Camp Barker 12th Street and Vermont Avenue Northwest, and Freeman's Village in Arlington, VA. On April 22nd, 1861, after the attack of Fort Sumner, Jacob Dodson wrote a letter to the Secretary of War to say, "I have some 300 reliable colored and free citizens in the city who desire to enter the services for the defense of the city." The only reply he received stated that this department has no intention at present to call into service of government any colored soldiers. In December 1861, Henry Wilson of Massachusetts entered a bill to end slavery in D.C. Amazingly, the bill passed and was signed into legislation on April 16, 1862. Congress then added an addendum on July 12, 1862, to allow slaves whose owners had not filed for compensation to do so, and allow blacks to testify about their claims. That same week, Congress passed the second Confiscation and Militia Act, freeing slaves nationwide whose owners served in the Confederate Army. This is the Afrocentricity Book Show. We are reading The History of the Black Dollar by Angel Rich. Nat Turner, my hero. Nat Turner, 1800 to 1831. The Prophet. Nat Turner was born on the Virginia plantation of Benjamin Turner, who allowed him to learn to read, write, and study religion. He was sold 3 times during his childhood and hired out to John Travis in the 1820s. He grew to an intense preacher in his Southampton County neighborhood, saying that he was selected by God to free the slaves. Turner was a heavy believer in signs and divine voices. During his childhood, when Nat Turner was 3 or 4 years old, he told some children about the event that happened to him before he was born. After his mother questioned him about the story, he confirmed its truth and was astonished at his ability. She felt he would surely be a prophet and was intended for a great purpose, which he truly was. Nat was always a natural leader amongst his friends. They counted on his superior judgment, as they felt he had a divine inspiration. Once it was largely discovered that Nat was going to be something great, he studiously avoided mixing in society and wrapped himself in mystery, devoting his time to fasting and prayer. Seek ye the kingdom of heaven, and all things shall be added unto you, was his favourite passage, and he prayed daily for clarity on it. One day while Nat was praying, the Spirit spoke to him, saying, Seek ye the kingdom of heaven, and all things shall be added unto you. For 2 years Nat prayed constantly for even more clarity. Finally, he had the same revelation, confirming to himself that he was ordained for a greater purpose with God. He then grew stronger in God, hardened his belief and ending slavery. Understanding the amount of trust his fellow slaves had for him, Nat began to prepare them for his purpose by informing them that something was about to occur, that he would fulfill a great promise made to him. Around this time, he was placed with an overseer that he ran away from, only to return after 30 days of hiding in the woods. The other slaves were surprised to see him, having thought that he would have escaped to some other part of the country, as his father had previously done. He said he returned because the Spirit appeared to him and said that he had his wishes focused on this world for not and not heaven. So he should return to the services of his earthly masters. For he who knoweth his master's will and doeth it shall be beaten with many stripes, and thus have I chastened you. Nat then had a vision. He saw a white spirit and black spirits in battle, and the sun was darkened, and thunder rolled in the heavens. Blood flowed in the streams, and a voice rung out, saying, Such is your luck, such you are called to see, and let it come through smooth. Let it come. I lost my page there. Let it come rough or smooth. You must surely bear it. This caused him to sink deeper into the reclusiveness of the avowed purpose of serving the Spirit entirely. His vision revealed to him the knowledge of the elements, the revolution of the planets, the operation of the tides and the changes of the seasons. He then received the true knowledge of faith, as the Holy Ghost came to him, saying, Behold me as I stand in the heavens. And he looked up to see the forms of men of different attitudes. And there were lights in the sky, to which the children of darkness gave other names than what they really were. For they were the lights of the Saviour's hands, stretched forth east to west, and even as they were extended on the cross on Calvary for the redemption of sinners. Nat was puzzled by these great miracles and constantly prayed the meaning of them, and he made certain which were made certain to him. Excuse me. Shortly afterwards, while in the fields, he found some corn with drops of blood on it, as though it was dew from heaven. After sharing his story with white and black neighbours, he found hieroglyphic characters and numbers, with the forms of men in different attitudes, portrayed in blood on leaves in the wood, representing the figures he had seen before in the heavens. At that moment, it became clear to him that the Holy Ghost was revealing itself to him, helping him to understand the miracles that had been shown. The message was, for as the blood of Christ had been shed on this earth and ascended to heaven for the salvation of sinners, and was now returning to earth again in the form of dew, and as the leaves on the trees bore impressions of the figures I had seen in the heavens, it was plain to me that the Saviour was about to lay down the yoke that he had borne for the sins of men, and a great day of judgment was at hand. He shared his vision with white men, whom stopped his wickedness, and was attacked with a curtainous eruption, resulting with blood oozing from his skin. After praying and fasting for 9 days, the man was healed. The spirit then appeared to Nat again, and said, as the Saviour had been baptized, so should we also. With this message, the slaves attempted to get baptized, but the white people would not allow them to be baptized by the church. So they went down to the water together before their family and friends, who were also baptized by the Spirit. On May the 12th, 1828, Nat heard a loud noise in the heavens, and the Spirit instantly appeared to him, saying the serpent was loosened, and Christ had laid down the yoke. He had borne for the sins of men. Excuse me. And that should fight the serpent, because the time was fast approaching when the first should be last and the last should be first. Nat then determined that heavenly sign would help him to know when to strike. He felt it was important to keep his plans to himself until he witnessed the first sign. When the sign came to him, an eclipse of the sun, in February, he decided to prepare to take the lives of the sinister people that had enslaved him with their own words, with their own tools of evil. Gunfire. Upon receiving the sign, Nat told his closest friends about his plans and the messages he received. Henry, Hark, Nelson and Sam, after much deliberation amongst themselves on how best to execute their plot, they landed on the 4th of July as the day that they would commence their attack. However, the foursome continued to debate so much over their plans that Nat fell ill in the process, and the time passed without the final decision. When the sign appeared to Nat again, he knew he could not wait no longer. On August the 21st, more of Nat's friends joined the movement as Henry Hark and himself cooked dinner for Sam, Nelson and Will and Jack in the woods. Nat welcomed them and greeted them as they arrived. When they asked will he join the group, he replied that his life was worth no more than others, and his liberty was dear to him. This made Nat fully trust Will thereafter. They stayed at the feast until about 2 hours in the night, until they went to the house to find another friend, Austin, who they all went to the cider's press to drink and except for Nat. Although Nat described his master as kind, feeling that the master had a great confidence in him, the group was definite that they wanted to start at his own big house, led by Mr. J. Travis. The group spared no one, regardless of age and sex, and armed themselves with equipment along the way. Approaching the house, Hark went to the door with an axe to break it open. Although he knew that they were strong enough to overpower the family, if they were disturbed by the noise, the crew decided to kill them in their sleep so they didn't alert the neighbours. Hark retrieved a ladder and placed it against the chimney. Nat then climbed up the ladder, entered through the window and came down the stairs, unlocked the door and removed all of the guns. With a hatchet in hand and Will at his side, Nat entered his martyr's, Travis's chamber in the dark. Not easily killed on the first strike, Travis leaped from his bed and yelled for his wife. It was his last word. Will killed the slave holder with a swift blow of his axe, following up with a double serving to his wife while she lay in bed. 5 in total laid slain in their sleep while the gentleman left. A while after they left, they remembered that they forgot about the infant who was asleep in the cradle. Returning to kill it, they took the opportunity also to gather 4 guns, some old muskets, and pounds or so of gunpowder. Celebrating, the crew went to a barn where Nat organized them as soldiers and taught them of the maneuvers he had learned. He then marched them off to Mr. Francis' house about 600 yards away. Sam and Will were the first to approach the door and knock. When Mr. Francis came to the door, Sam told him he had a letter for him. To get him to open the door. Once inside, the pair grabbed him, dragged him out of the door and repeatedly beat him in the head. He was the only white person in the family. From then, the justice seekers set off for Mrs. Reese. Proudly, they remained in stealth, silence, as they marched to her home, where they discovered the door unlocked. Entering with ease, they killed Mrs. Reese while sleeping in her bed. Alerted to the noise, her son yelled out, "Who is that?" It was his last words. Happily, the crew headed for Mrs. Turner's property, about a mile away from Reese's house. They reached the estate around sunrise. On Monday morning, as they approached the property, Sam and Austin went to the still. Austin found and killed Mr. Peoples. There were Peoples there while the others went to the house. The family saw them coming and quickly shut the door. With a stroke of his axe, Will opened the door and back up, finding Mrs. Turner and Mrs. Newsom in the middle of the room, scared to death. Will immediately killed Mrs. Turner, and Nat took the sword he had when he was apprehended and struck Mrs. Newsom several times in the head, but was unable to kill her because the sword was dull. Upon discovering of this difficulty, Will killed her as well. As like all of the other times, the crew then ransacked the house in search of money and ammunition. By this time, Nat's crew numbered 15. 9 of the men were mounted on horses and started for Mrs. Winhead's property, while the others 600 headed for Mr. Bryant's. As they approached the house, Mr. Whitehead was discovered standing on a cotton patch. The group called him closer to them. As he came nearer, Will the executioner sent him to an early grave. They pushed forward to the house. Upon entering, Nat saw a girl running around the garden and chased after her. Once he finally caught up with her, he realized that the girl was a servant and set her free. Once he got back in the house, the family had been murdered except for Mrs. Whitehead and her daughter Margaret. As expected, Will nearly severed her head from her body with a broad axe. Concealed in a corner of the cellar cap now stood Miss Margaret. Running from that, she was soon engulfed with repeat hits from his sword. and a final blow to the head with a fence rail. Returning from her stud duties, the other 6 came back with good news of the murder of Mrs. Bryant. They then split up again to go to Mrs. Porter's, and from there to Mr. Francis's and others, Mr. Harris and Mr. Doyle's homes. By the time they reached Mr. Porter's, he had already safely escaped with his family. At that moment, Nat realized that the alarm had been resounded, and that the word of his unrest was started to spread. He left immediately to retrieve the others that had been separated from them, killing Mr. Doyle on the road along the way. On his way to Captain Harris's, he checked the homes of Mr. Edwards and Mr. Barrow for his company, but found the whites were already killed. He found most of the crew at Harris's, amped and ready to start their next round. The men now numbered at roughly 40, rejoiced in jubilation as Nat Turner rode up the yard, loading their guns and drinking. Meanwhile, Captain Harris and his family had escaped, so they destroyed the property in the house, taking the money and valuables. Nat then ordered them all to march to Mr. Waller's, 2 or 3 miles away from their location at 9 a.m. Monday morning. Stationed at the rear, Nat saw this place was to carry terror and devastation wherever they travelled. He situated 15 or 20 of his best soldiers in the front. These gentlemen usually entered the house as fast as the horses would allow, serving 2 purposes: prevent escape and strike fear into the residence. As such, Nat usually entered the house with the murders committed before he even could reach the door. Nat recounts that sometimes he would get sight of the murder in action, and he would watch in silent satisfaction, immediately desiring his next victims. After Mrs. Waller and her 10 children were killed, the Take No Prisoners team set their sights on Mr. Williams. In the midst of the killing, him and his 2 kids, his wife escaped and got pretty far from the house. However, she was captured and brought back to the house, where she was showed the mangled body of her dead husband. She was then told to lay on her side, where she was shot dead. Killing a few more families and gathering more soldiers, they now stood at 50 or 60 in total, all mounted and armed. Nat decided to head for Jerusalem, Virginia, as soon as possible. So I think I'm going to call it an end now here. He's just gone to the time. Well, we just read about Nat Turner's uprising. I heard people say before, because Nat Turner, they said that they went away and they left a child, and they remember that the child was still there, and they went back to kill the child. And people said, well, how can he kill the child? But who was that child being when the child grew up? Who were the men who enslaved Africans? Weren't they originally children? So if you're going to have a revolution, you need to have a full revolution. Anyway, it's 6 o'clock now. This is Brother Jegna. This is the Afrocentristic Bookman show. We are reading The History of the Black Pound, The History of the Black Dollar by Angel Rich. And we are partway through now. We are on page 29, so we'll start again on page 29. We'll finish off the uprising of Nat Turner. I hope you all see that film. It's called Birth of a Nation. Told the story of Nat Turner. It was actually a brilliant film. The film companies and theatres did everything they could to suppress the film. When some people went to see the film USA, they said it sold out. And when a guy looked in the door, the cinema was empty except for about 2 or 3 people. So they ensured that it didn't get the numbers so it could go up for an Oscar. Because clearly this should have had an Oscar. But it was a powerful film. Nat Turner was a true American. Why would I say that? Narrative is supposed to be about freedom and equality. And that's what Nat Turner was doing, saying, listen, we need freedom and equality, and you're not going to give it to us, so you have to feel the sword. Didn't the USA fight Britain to get rid of them? This is what Nat Turner's doing himself. So Nat Turner was a true American because he said we need equality and freedom and we'll die for it. Anyway, this is Brother Jegna. Have a great week, yeah? Please remember, what we do for ourselves depends on what we think of ourselves. And what we think of ourselves depends on what we are taught about ourselves. And what we are taught about ourselves depends on what others truly taught us. So, Afrocentricity Bookman Show is for us to get our minds together to understand who we are, understand our history, so we can move on and get back to our rightful place. So have a great week. This is Brother Jegna checking out with you. Have a great week, and I'll catch you next week. Yeah, don't forget Best Radio every Sunday between 4 and 6 p.m. So one love, yeah? I'll see you next week. Bless.
Show is sponsored by Glass R Us, 730 Seven Sisters Road, London, N15 5NH. Call Glass R Us for all your glazing needs on 0208 800 6663. For your glass and double glazing repairs, shelving, tabletops, splashbacks, mirrors, shower cubicles, balustrades and balconies.
You can trust Glass R Us because they are completely transparent.
Dancing in heaven. You hear me?
Wake up, people. Wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people. Wake up now.
Wake up.
Wake up, people. Wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up the people, Lord. Wake up.
Listen.
Wake up, people. Wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people. Wake up now.
Wake up.
Wake up, people. Wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up the people, Lord. Wake up.
Listen.